Welcome to this, our latest webinar in our series here at George Washington University Law School. It's a series on procurement issues from around the world. Welcome to this session, which is going to be discussing the exchange of qualification information between nations, procurement without borders, exchanging contractor qualification information internationally. Again, thank you for joining us. The recordings and materials from this program will be available at publicprocurementinternational.com. They'll also be available on the website for the George Washington University Law School Government Procurement Law Program on YouTube. So if you just go to YouTube and you search for GW Law Government Procurement, you'll see it there. Today, you're very welcome to ask questions as we go. Please use the Q&A function. That's what we'll be using to respond to questions and answers. The panelists and the moderators will be responding to questions as well as we go. I should note that all speaker statements are in their personal capacity. Again, I'm Chris Yukins. I'm a professor at George Washington University Law School, and I want to extend a special greeting to our guests and co-moderators from the Bundesbeschaffung Austria. The BBG is a co-sponsor with us in launching this program. We really appreciate their help and cooperation in launching this. This program is done in conjunction with the Public Procurement Excellence Program, which is run by the BBG. It is a program for building capacity in officials from the centralized purchasing bodies from across Europe. Now, our focus today is on qualification information regarding contractors. Qualification information, contractor qualification information, if it's readily available to procuring entities, can reduce corruption risk and can reduce performance risk. So it's a very important source of good procurement practice. Globally, we're at the very first stages of sharing information, contractor qualification information, across borders, between governments, between procuring entities. And the purpose of today's program is to start to share some of the experiments, some of the innovation that's being done around the world with regards to sharing contractor qualification information. The moderators include Flach, who is from the BBG, and Donna Mitea, who is also from BBG. They've been instrumental in building the PPE, the Public Procurement Excellence Program at the BBG. And if you're interested in learning more about that program, it's profiled in a January 2023 report from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. It's there on the left-hand side there on the slide. And page 68 is just a discussion of the PPE program. It's quite extraordinary. And there's a link to that on our program page, publicprocurementinternational.com, at publicprocurementinternational.com. There's also a link to the panel slides if you'd like to see those. Professor Gabriella Racca, who's a very dear colleague of mine, teaches at the University of Turin. She's co-moderator with us today. She and I both teach in the PPE program, and we found it a very interesting, important way to exchange best practices among officials from centralized purchasing agencies from across purchasing bodies from across Europe. Albert Sanchez-Graells joins us from the University of Bristol. He is the author of a blog called howtocrackanut.com, and he this morning published a very interesting piece on the use of centralized purchasing agencies to acquire cutting-edge software in the European Union. I highly recommend it to you. He's also participating in a program series, a webinar series with my colleague Jessica Tolman on tech fixes for procurement problems. That's available. The session that's already occurred is available on the YouTube page for GW Law's Government Procurement Law Program. We're also joined by Tünde, who is from Corvinus University in Hungary, in Budapest. She is doing a Fulbright in Florida. We've gotten a chance to see more of her and her family here in the United States. We're very glad that she could join us. And Tünde is a specialist on European procurement issues. We're just delighted that she could join us today. So I'm going to go through with you quickly what the panelists will be covering. Our first panelist is Gian Luigi Albano, who's the head of division at Italy's centralized purchasing agency, CONSIP. He's going to be discussing practical hurdles grounded in organizational theory to exchanging contractor information between governments. As Luigi will be explaining, there are predictable problems. There are predictable problems in asking agencies to exchange contractor qualification information, and he'll be talking about those. Lucian Cernat and Zornitsa Kutlina-Dimitrova are senior economists at the European Commission. They focus on trade issues at the Commission. They're going to discuss efforts by the Commission to ease exchanges of contractor information to reduce barriers to trade and procurement and to improve trade analysis. One of the very interesting things about their presentation that I finally realized going through the materials that they have prepared, the Access to Procurement website that Lucian is going to be talking about specifically, is that nationality, the source, the home country of the vendor itself becomes an element of qualification. That's a very interesting part of the qualification puzzle. We're also joined by Misi Fazekas, who's an assistant professor at the Central European University in Vienna. He's a scientific director of a think tank, the Government Transparency Institute, and he's going to be discussing a very innovative tool that he and his colleagues developed called TenderX, which assembles contractor qualification information from multiple government sources around the world. It's really an extraordinary innovative tool pulling in contractor qualification information. And as you'll see from Misi's presentation, not only are they pulling in information from multiple governments, but they're curating that information. They're analyzing that information to create a workable tool for contracting officials to use in assessing what we would call in the United States contractor responsibility. Also joined by Lindle Hatton, who is the Chief Executive Officer at the National Association of State Procurement Officials, or NASPO. He's going to discuss coordination among the U.S. states through the NASPO value point contracts. The NASPO value point contracts, or what in the European Union would be called framework agreements, internationally be called framework agreements that are available for state and local governments all across the United States. They're really a multi-billion dollar initiative to make it possible for state and local governments to purchase from common framework agreements in what in the United States is called cooperative purchasing, and in the European Union is referred to as joint procurement. Kathrin Frauscher of the Open Contracting Partnership is going to explain how procurement data can be made open using the data structure, the data standards that have been developed by the Open Contracting Partnership. This is really the next stage, the making it possible through common data standards for countries, for governments, for agencies to be able to exchange contractor qualification information, contracting information efficiently. And finally, Maria Swaby, who's the procurement ombudsman and former suspension and debarment official for the U.S. General Services Administration. She lectures with me. We recently spent a weekend together teaching a course on debarment and qualification at GW Law School. She's going to discuss how the U.S. government makes contractor qualification information available to the System for Award Management, which is SAM.gov, and related online platforms. So thank you all very much for joining us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Luigi.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Well, thank you for getting me aboard this nice event. This is going to be a very short presentation about some practical issues, but I would say also some logical issues concerning qualification. So sharing information about qualification of vendors. So first slide, please. So I'm going to make actually two main points. One point is about what happens within the same country, and within the same country, ground for exclusion, and in general, when a contracting authority gathers information about particular firm that might lead these contracting authorities to debar or to exclude a firm from participating in a competitive tender, is in principle an extremely valuable piece of information for everybody else in the system, and needless to say, for all other contracting authorities. Now, this is in a traditional system, so let's forget for a timing about the possibility that technology helps us. This is a standard problem, which is, the private provision of, contribution to a public good. So this is a valuable piece of information for everybody, but it's only one procuring entity which is in charge of bearing the cost of providing that information. And this leads normally to an under provision of the public good. So no one is, or in principle, no one is willing to pay the cost if everybody else is going to reap the benefits of that. So given that it's very difficult to design a set of incentive schemes in order to make this happen, then what happens and may happen in some countries, and definitely happens in a country such as Italy, is that there is an external, an overarching system of rules, legal rules, forcing every contracting authorities to do so. So please, second slide, Chris. Which is, you can think of a centralized authority, and you don't have to think about, you know, a physical body. You can think of a centralized system, could be a technological solution, you name it. But in Italy, given that I live here, so I want to provide you with an insight about what happens here. There is the oversight authority for public procurement and for anti-corruption, whose acronym is ANAC, A-N-A-C, which gathers information about all these extremely important events. And so there is a law that basically forces everybody to send information to the system and to the authority, and that authority becomes the sort of the owner and the holder and the handler of the public good, which is the centralized information. So in that way, you basically, one can overcome the difficulty of providing individual incentives to contracting authorities. So if everybody abides by the law, everybody will send this information. This information will be gathered, handled, and distributed to all other contracting authorities. And in principle, we will have produced exactly the desirable amount of public good that the system needs, right? Now, third slide. Now, suppose you want to bring this system to an even higher level, which is the level, European level, could be even a world level, doesn't matter, supranational level. What happens is that if you think of it, at least within the European boundaries, is that now you should think of a supernatural centralized system handling information coming from each single country. And this, again, would be even more interesting and valuable because that would benefit, you know, contracting authorities in France, in Austria, in Germany, in Belgium, you name it. Now, the point is that what is the difficulty in implementing is not necessarily a technological or operational difficulties, because you can set an authority, an organization doing that. The difficulty, which is practical, and the practice comes from what happens on the supply side, is that normally two seemingly identical entities bidding for a contract in Italy and in Austria, say, although they belong to the same perimeter, they belong to the same holding, very seldom they are exactly the same entity. So there will be entity belonging to the same holding bidding for Italian contract, and another entity, which is a separate legal entity, bidding for the Austrian contract or tenders. So the difficulties that there might be a concrete and I would say extremely practical difficulty in using information coming from Italy, because that would not apply to that company, you know, operating in Austria. So when it comes to extreme, severe decisions like excluding or debarring a vendor, that might pose a lot of problems. A completely different set of questions that I believe some of my co-speakers will address is the extent to which one can use this set of information for other purposes than just, you know, dramatically debarring or excluding a firm from participating in a tender. So I think that there is a discontinuity in bringing this line of reasoning and the possible solutions from the national level to the international level. But again, this is a matter of the way, you know, this is my personal opinion, the way the market works, rather than the possibility of using appropriate set of rules rather than, you know, a good toolbox of technological solutions. Okay, thank you. I'll stop here, Chris. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'll pass it then over to Gian and to Zornitsa.
Yes, thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here today in such a very advanced procurement discussion on cutting-edge information sharing tools, the potential that digital tools may have on public procurement. We are now simply just scratching the surface, and I think today we are going to hear a lot about some very promising tools. I would like to present to you one tool that we have developed recently at the European Commission in the Trade Directorate. And but I need to give you a little bit of a background in order to understand where we're coming from, because we sit at the interface between trade policy and public procurement. So we in the European Union, we have over 40 free trade agreements. We have been declared by the WTO as the world champion of free trade agreements. So there are a lot of international rules, legally binding commitments between us and several jurisdictions around the world, which offer international procurement opportunities for companies in the EU and vice versa for companies in countries like Canada, Japan, all the GPA, the Government Procurement Agreement members at the WTO. So there is a lot of opportunities for companies to engage in cross-border public procurement. However, these legal provisions can be quite daunting to understand and to apply correctly, even for experienced public contracting authorities, as we have discovered ourselves in the EU. Take, for instance, the EU-Canada FTA, also known as CETA. It has over 1,500 pages. More than 350,000 words, very complex legal provisions, many technical terms. The procurement chapter and the procurement rules account for roughly 10% of that text. Essentially, it's a book bigger than the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And sometimes the language is written in legalese. It's probably more complicated than Elvish. So even if you're not an expert, if you are a small company or even a procurement official who is not very well versed in international trade rules and procedures, you may easily lose the FTA plot, and you will probably apply the procurement provisions in that FTA in the wrong way, or you as a company may not understand that maybe there is an opportunity for you to have a legal entitlement to bid for a contract in Canada or in Japan. So there is this need for what I call the easification of the procurement chapters in our free trade agreements, especially for small and medium enterprises. It may come as a surprise to people, but small and medium enterprises are not incapable of winning contracts, including international contracts. So in the EU, we still need to move from one country to another, and SMEs are quite active, and the same applies also to cross-border procurement in an international context. So we adopted this digitalization of trade policy, what I like to call a trade policy 2.0 approach. We borrow from the existing methodology. There is a very burgeoning, very promising, the so-called legal tech, a lot of artificial intelligence and algorithms that can be used to translate rules and law into code, into computer code. So with that logic in mind, we created the access to procurement. Maybe Chris wants to move to the next slide just to give people a sense of how it looks like. The idea is to make it extremely simple and to allow companies to decide for themselves in a very simple step-by-step approach if they qualify to bid for a contract, say in Canada. The tool initially was produced with the European companies in mind, but after discussing with stakeholders and after its successful launch, we have now thousands of companies consulting this tool, trying to understand where business opportunities lie abroad. We also realize that it's very useful for contracting authorities themselves. So Japanese contracting authorities, we realized that in a few occasions, they were not fully aware of the EU-Japan Free Trade Agreement, and they were hesitant on how exactly to treat some bidders from the EU. with this tool, as a contracting authority in a foreign country, you can decide for yourself whether you should accept a bid from a European company, whether they qualify or whether they have a legal right to bid for a contract under specific conditions. So the complexity of this procurement chapter, the thousands of pages I mentioned before, if you think of the parameters that are required for you to reach a decision, you have several elements. You have the contracting authority itself. Not all contracting authorities are covered by a free trade agreement. Some are, some aren't. So if you are a contracting authority that will be covered by these international legal obligations, then the next question is which particular product or service or works, construction, what exactly are we going to procure? And here again, we have thousands of CPV codes, thousands of combinations of goods and services that may or may not be covered by these legal obligations. Then you have the additional complexity of thresholds. So these trade agreements, they only liberalize and give you rights as a contractor or as a bidder for contracts above certain thresholds. And these thresholds vary on the basis of whether it's goods, services, or works. So with all this complexity and these parameters that you have to keep in mind, we calculated that for CETA to be fully covered by someone to have the full picture, you would end up with roughly 200 million potential combinations of contracting authority, subcentral, federal, or otherwise, goods and services, yes, no covered, and the thresholds. It's a very complex equation to solve. And that equation is solved very simply by this tool. If we were to go step by step, as I think we have a couple of more slides to show an example. So you would choose the entity, say first you choose the country, say Canada. You may type in the name or a kind of a keyword from the name of the entity. If you know it, you are, say you want to bid in a particular ministry or a federal agency, then the jurisdiction, you would choose perhaps a province if it's a federal state. You can choose a sector. As I said, you can say goods or electrical equipment, or you can say construction. And then you click on search and you would move to the next stage in the tool, where after putting in all these parameters, the tool will give you a straight answer, but not a legally binding answer. A straight answer in the sense that with these very specific parameters, there is no ambiguity as long as your answers were accurate, that you fall within or outside the scope of the free trade agreement. Therefore, you would be legally entitled to bid or not. So in this particular example that Chris, I see he has went through the tool, he picked some examples, and in this case, you see a green answer, meaning that a particular bidder would be entitled to submit an offer for that contract in Canada. The same valuable information can be used by the Canadian contracting authority, because now they would know that in case they receive, if the Board of Negotiation, the Environmental Protection Agency in Canada would receive an offer from a European company, they would have a legal obligation to accept that offer, of course, subject to all the other conditions in the tender. So we decided to start with this tool in order to move from complex legal language to simple step-by-step trade facilitation. We knew that companies struggled tremendously to use these provisions. We did a survey before doing the tool, and 40% of European companies said they had no idea how to implement this. So now we're very happy that most of the feedback is very positive. We receive ideas how to improve it. We might include a few other countries, including our most valued ally and our biggest trading partner, which I don't need to name, but it's clearly on the back of our minds. And I hope that will be added to the tool in order to facilitate transatlantic procurement. So I will stop here, Chris, and I'm happy to take questions later on.
Thank you very much, Lucian. I just as in terms of your relations with the United States, what's interesting is the transaction costs for the purchasers on the U.S. side are too intense to keep track of what specific agencies, for instance, are covered. It's assumed, for example, that all executive agencies are covered because the transaction costs are too high. This tool allows the users across the board to have much more precision, a much clearer understanding of which agencies are covered. Zornitsa?
Thanks a lot, Chris, and also thanks for the invitation. It's great to be part of this terrific panel. Given the time allotted for my intervention, I will focus on one or two main aspects of the work Lucian and I did a couple of years ago on assessing the openness of European procurement markets to US firms. And in order to do that, we actually made use of a concept we developed a couple of years even before that, on which are the ways to which foreign companies can participate in international procurement. And very quickly to refresh the minds of our listeners, or maybe of some people who are not familiar with those. We believe there are three ways in which firms can participate in foreign bids. One will be through the direct cross-border procurement modality, which would mean the firm that is located in another country submits and wins a bid from abroad. Then there is a way to participate through foreign affiliates, where basically a firm that is a subsidiary of another firm submits a bid and wins it locally. And then we have a pretty complex modality, which we call the value-added indirect international procurement, where firms participate in international bids by providing indirectly goods and services along the value chain. And the most frequent vehicle for that is through subcontracting. And the figure you see below is just a snapshot of the amount of foreign contracts that the EU awards to US firms. And we can see that in 2017, now you have another figure here, but then you see that modality, we have the three different modalities, and out of these, the US firms were awarded 11 billion euros in contract, and we see that the most important vehicle is modality 2, followed by modality 3. And now here I would like to make the link with the topic of today's panel, which is really which is about the contractor qualification information. And Chris, you already stole my punchline, because you mentioned that you realized that indeed, and I believe it's true, one of the most important information on the supplier is really the nationality of the bidder. And it sounds very simple, but it's not, because for a firm to be able at all to bid in a foreign country, unless we are in Wonderland and there is a country that has no restriction whatsoever on government procurement for no firm, actually the nationality of the bidder determines or not this country has participated as a party in an international free trade agreement or the multilateral GPA. It actually what qualifies at all this firm to participate in a foreign tender. And given the reality we live in, that is totally influenced by mergers, participation of firms in consortia, but also the type of data we deal with, where most often the information we see on the vendor, on the supplier, is really the address of the supplier, which doesn't tell us anything, because it could be a foreign subsidiary, it could be a subcontractor that participates indirectly, and especially for the US in a market that it's very much affected by local provisions. I mean, this modality free procurement, it's extremely important to be able to assess if this supplier at all qualifies to participate in a bid. So to sum up, to obtain a sound information on the nationality of the bidder, if this firm, what is the nationality of this firm after all, it's key, and I would say the most important qualifying information we should gather. And for that, there are three very important points. The first one is to make sure we do have access to comparable contract award data, and here comparable contract award data means definitely e-procurement. So without e-procurement tools, we basically cannot process this data at all. The second point, having a harmonized, at best following the procurement lifecycle data would be a huge help in this respect, and Kathrin from the Open Contracting Partnership will tell you much more about that, but I would like to mention that would be a key way to ensure that we deal with a comparable data across countries, across continents, and then we can make much better use of this information and assess the qualification of the supplier in a harmonized and consistent way. And last but not least, if we would manage to get a common and unique firm identifier in international procurement, would be immense valuable step in this respect, because obtaining this data is costly. We have to have access to data that matches the name of the firm through additional type of information to order to identify the final name of the firm, through matching algorithms, and to buy expensive data sets from expensive data providers. And all of this could be simplified tremendously if we would have a unique firm identifier that we could track across countries and across types of firms and across firms' entries and exits, etc. And I will stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Zornitsa. Then I'll turn it over to Mishi.
Great. Thanks a lot, Chris. Hope everyone can hear me. I'm super happy to be in such an illustrious company of various speakers and a big group of attendees. I will try to link to a couple of the presenters, in particular Lucian and Zornitsa's presentation, but also to some degree feed on what OCP, Open Contracting Partnership, will talk about. So basically, the tool I would like to introduce very briefly is called TenderX, and it's based on lots of data which is published by EU governments, lots of data which is in open contracting data standard, but also data coming from a range of other open contracting data and open procurement initiatives. So overall, what's behind our tool is more than 100 million contracts covering a bit more than 6 million suppliers, and the country coverage is 60 plus. So most of the data comes from 60 countries, mainly in Americas, North and South, and Europe, but also a bunch of other countries. And the idea is, as Chris kindly introduced us, that we bring academic quality data science and research to problems which are otherwise very hard to understand. Zornitsa very amply demonstrated some of these problems. So we do collect this data and we also curate it. Curating means not just to put it in a single standardized structure, but also improve data quality wherever possible. So we could say that some of the data we hold is actually better than what governments have in their own data set. So for example, we fill the blanks when companies' address is missing. We pass through company names, for example, Google Maps API. So we do know the addresses in a much more standardized and consistent ways than governments themselves. And all this is accessible through the TenderX portal. Now, if you go to the next slide, Chris, I would like to show you a few things, what lies behind. So on the one hand, these standardized reports by TenderX drawing on this data give you an insight on the various risk components, the risk profile of a supplier, if you like. So looking at things like single bidding, so one bid submitted on an otherwise competitive market, so a tender which would expect to have multiple bidders, but only one company shows up. Looking at procedure type risks, so direct awards versus open tendering procedures, so on and so forth. So the idea is that for each supplier, these sorts of risks are tracked based on the contracts the company wins. And these numbers, these percentages, these risk factors are actually put into context. And context is very important because if I tell you that, oh, this company's single bidding rate is 30%, is it a lot or is it not, right? So you need to understand what's the average behavior in the market the company is active in, and where that company is located. So if a company is, if a market is otherwise highly competitive, right, we have 3, 4, 5 bidders for an average tender, and the company looks like having no competitors, so it's frequent single bidder, that's a red flag for us, right? That is something we want to understand. However, if a company is very much close to the average of the market behavior, maybe the very same number carries a very different information. Now, even though we talk about contractor qualification in general, it is actually a very dynamically changing thing, right? So that's why my figure on the right-hand side of the slide. So the tendering reports allow you to look at the company's performance according to various risk factors over time and compared to the benchmark group, right? So it might be that the company's performance is consistent, but the benchmark moves. Or it can be that the benchmark is stable, but the company somehow goes up or down. So understanding these changes in company behavior is crucial for understanding how well or not well a particular company behaves. You can go to the next slide, Chris. So the other aspect of company performance is to understand how consistent that company is in the procurement market. It's easy to think of companies as a thing, but actually companies behave in different ways depending on with whom they are contracting. So might have a company, a construction company in this example, there its risks are much higher in one relation, dealing with one buyer versus dealing with another buyer, okay? So understanding how the very same company behaves differently in different relations is crucial for understanding what the company is capable of doing. In some cases, it might behave and might contract with high risks. In some others, it might be relatively low risk. And moving on to my final slide and sticking to the time allocated, and I'm sure Chris will be happy to hear that this report not just gives you an overview of the risk profile of the company, again, to repeat, drawing on data from a large number of countries, but it also gives you an overview of the procurement profile, so the standard contracting features of a company, so the amount of number of contracts, the amount of contract value over time, or looking at various localities, regions, or countries, and also looking at various markets. It can be very high-level sectors like healthcare or construction, but also drilling deeper into very specific sub-markets of product groups. So to conclude and link this short presentation back to the main topic of contractor qualification. So I think where open procurement data compiled, brought into a single structure, curated, can help is by giving a quick overview of various companies' performance in terms of risk factors, sources of risk, integrity risk, other risks, and also looking at the company's overall performance. And what's crucial and what's sort of unique in our approach is that we draw on objective administrative government data pulled directly from government data portals or advertisement portals. So this is something which is directly traceable back to the official source. So something which can be trusted and verified. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mishi. So just to put it in context, oftentimes the qualification assessments here in the United States, Mishi, are as simple as a Google search. You search the name of the company just before the award. So this approach that you're taking is really a revelation. Thank you. With that, I'll turn it over to Lindle.
Thank you, Chris. It's an honor to be able to join each of the panelists today. I'm intrigued by what I've been hearing regarding procurement without borders as I listen to the various presenters on tools and strategies, how to better facilitate procurement across the borders. It's very helpful for me as we consider where we are and where we may go in the future. NASPO is the National Association of State Procurement Officials. representing all of the 50 states, District of Columbia, and US territories. We've been in existence for approximately, well, this is our 76th year. The business arm for us is the Value Point division, which is a cooperative purchasing division. And as Chris mentioned in the beginning, I guess it's known as a joint procurement in the European Union. It is also known as a GPO, Group Purchasing Organization. And the idea behind that is to allow states to come together, bond together through collective group purchasing power to obtain the best value on cooperative contracts. So we use a lead state model wherein one state will agree to serve as the lead state, manage the contract. Others may participate through participating addendums and enjoy the benefit through that group purchasing effort. Now, the idea behind the cooperative purchasing arm is so that we can better control transactional costs to offer benefit to states in terms of reducing the staff requirements, reducing some of the burden to them that they would have to do independently if they did not have the joint collective opportunity through group purchasing organizations like Value Point. We've been in existence for 31 years. Part of our best value includes not always perhaps the lowest price, but the best price as far as terms and conditions, warranties, things that would address delivery, restock types of things. So all of those things are important. The other thing that is important for our members as well, even though across the United States, we recognize the sovereignty of each state, knowing that there are certain procurement requirements and regulations specific to the states, we do have the ability to collectively come together and negotiate terms and conditions that can be beneficial to all of them. It requires that it's a competitive process, that it be transparent. Those are kind of the standards, if you will. But we encounter many of the same problems that you've been addressing here on this call today. How do we vet suppliers, ensure that we have qualified suppliers to fulfill the contracts once they are awarded? Diversity of suppliers. Those are critical issues. Data analytics, which Misi just addressed. We are encountering that on an ongoing basis. That's all part of this competitive, transparent process that we try to bring as value to our procurement officials within the states. And now, as we are exploring across the borders with these same suppliers, we're hearing that many of the same problems exist, not just in the United States, but across the borders. And the more that we can envelop practices and standards that are universal, I think it will ensure the success of procurement. So thank you for the opportunity to participate today.
Thank you very much, Lindle. With that, I'll turn it over to Kathrin.
Great, thank you, everyone. I just wanted to say, I'm Austrian and I grew up in Italy and I now live in Washington, DC, and I work globally on procurement. So I feel like there could be no better place for me to be on a Friday morning than with all of you here, because it all seems to come together. So thank you for having me. I wanted to echo a few of the points that already have been made and then maybe just bring some additional considerations to the conversation. As I'm with the Open Contracting Partnership and we are the stewards of the Open Contracting Data Standard, I just wanted to give some more information about the OCDS and then talk about the benefits that it has for cross-border trade and then lift up some additional points. Chris, maybe actually go first to the next slide for a second and then I come back to the map. Thank you so much. So the OCDS has been mentioned, but it's a globally recognized open source procurement standard. At the heart is the idea that you should be able to follow information all the way from planning that you see on the slide through implementation with unique IDs. And we have heard the importance of these unique IDs and records for making cross-border information sharing and decision-making easier. So the standard provides guidance on what to publish and how to publish it. So if with that you come back to the first slide, you will see on the map here that we have 60 agencies around the world that publish information using the Open Contracting Data Standard. Many of these agencies, organizations are national procurement agencies or national agencies, so that you get access to a wide volume and set of procurement data. Looking at the call here, for example, we heard about Italy in the beginning. The anti-corruption agency that was mentioned uses the OCDS to publish procurement information. Unfortunately, not yet Austria. In the US, we have SAM.gov, and Maria will speak about that in a moment. They recently introduced a unique entity identifier, which is a big improvement. Not all information in the US is open data yet, although it's a legal requirement, and not all of it is machine readable yet, which is also important, right? A lot of information is still hidden in PDFs, which makes the work of everyone harder. So if there's interest, that's always something we could help with as well. Looking at the EU, if you see, there's a lot of green and blue here, but as we heard before, there's a huge opportunity in the European Union right now to make procurement data better, and those are e-forms. E-forms are becoming mandatory in less than a year, and we really strongly encourage the publication beyond the minimum 100 fields that are currently required, because if you think about the wealth of data and that could be generated, that then could be used for decision making and using technology, that would be really a game changer. But coming back, if you go to that last slide, my third slide, please, to how all of this helps with trade. We already have heard that open data can make a huge difference in accessing information across countries. So in addition to some of the tools that already were mentioned, there are also bid aggregators that exist. They're often private, but some are BidHive, OpenOps, or B2Gov that help companies find bidding opportunities in other countries using the OCDS. The WTO, under the GPA guidelines, also requires that certain procurement information is accessible both to companies that are bidding, but also governments that have to report on it. In reality, right, governments really struggle to share this information, and we have some guidance here of how that could be easier using the OCDS. And we have seen in places like Ukraine that using OCDS-based data can really improve information sharing and reporting on those procurement data required under the WTO. And then I wanted to lift up two more points with my last 2 minutes. Mishi started to talk about that, but when you think about cross-border trade, I think it's not only important to think about the qualifications for the award period, but also about vendor performance information, right? You want to ensure that you award your contracts to vendors that deliver. And I think that is often an underexplored field that would be great to come back to during the conversation. What more is there that we can do to exchange contract performance and vendor performance information? And maybe my last point that we have not talked about yet, a lot about this is also about the experience for companies when they pursue public procurement opportunities, right? We all know how difficult it is for a vendor in their own country to, register as a vendor, find an opportunity, submit the bids, get awarded, and get paid. To do this abroad in a different country is even harder. So I think if we want to promote cross-border procurement, it's also very important to think about this vendor experience and how I liked when we talked about before about the easification of trade agreements. There also needs to be a simplification of how you engage in public procurement and can bid and win and get paid as a company. With that, I think I'm handing over to Maria.
Thank you so much, Kathrin. Maria, the floor is yours.
Hi, yes, thank you. And a lot of people alluded to some common themes. I know there's a talk about the unique entity identifier number, and Kathrin just pointed to the fact that we as a US government are finally finally gotten to that point. And I wanted to talk about contractor qualification, and if you can imagine like a funnel shape with the broadest at the top, point is narrow. So in the US, there are several ways that we use for contractor qualification, and SAM.gov, the System for Award Management, is sort of the major tool that houses lots of different methods of which we use to qualify contractors. And if you think at the top of the funnel is just the basic requirement to register in SAM. If any company or corporation wants to do business, or individual wants to do business with the US federal government, you have to have a SAM registration. And that's the most basic of contractor qualifications, where you're just giving information about company name, address, incorporation, some of your financial structure, points of contact. So that's the first and most basic level of contractor communication. We want to make sure that you actually exist as a company. And one of those things we use is this unique entity identifier, UEI for short. And we've come a long way with this. When I started back in GSA about 14 years ago, we used to use the Dun and Bradstreet numbers as identifiers. And of course, there was an uproar about that, rightly so, because as a private company, that information was gathered from. And so after many years of lobbying for the government issuing its own UEI, that's where we are. I would say we started last year. It's been a painful transition process. So for those out there who are frustrated with us, we're almost at the 1-year mark. And so when we get to that 1-year mark, most of the frustration should have died down, and most people should have gotten their unique entity identifier. So that's one step. It gets a little narrow because we then come down to the contractor qualification, and we use qualification and responsibility interchangeably in the SAM world, and that has a little bit more specific information with regards to the contractor. So one of the things that they do have would be exclusions, and exclusions is a broad term in US federal government contracting. It means exclusion in the sense of debarment and suspension, that you're not able to do business with the government. But there are also other exclusions that are in SAM. There are products that are excluded from the US government buying market. Just a few years ago, we had big exclusions on certain telecommunications equipment by certain Chinese-made companies. So example like Huawei with their phones and their components, we cannot buy that. So exclusions in SAM, very broad. And so that gets down to a little bit narrow, and then we come back down to even more narrow specification on contractor qualification of the contractor. You can be qualified on the big, broad requirements of registration. You could be qualified in terms of being responsible, but your company or an individual in your company could do something that could usurp all of that, and that might lead to a debarment or a suspension. And those are either temporary or long-term means of excluding a contractor from getting government business for a certain period of time. That information is listed in SAM. Obviously, we're working towards transparency, as Kathrin kind of alluded to. We're growing in our transparency practices, and so there's limited information even in SAM on the causes for the debarment, except some generic type terms. But for now, the public can access these records. The last one that gets really to the bottom point of the funnel is responsible and integrity records. And so that goes down very detailed to the specific company. And that one, Professor Yukins is going to click on the link just to show an example of what this is. And by the way, all these links that are are available to the public. A lot of the information on responsibility and contractor qualifications, you do actually have to be signed into SAM to see them, but there are a few that you can just see without being signed in. And the public can sign in and create an account. So it's just that it's not available, but you do have to create a SAM account. This is an example of some of the information that you can download directly from SAM regarding particular contractors. And this is a spreadsheet that will give you the unique entity ID, the name of the contractor, the address, all that stuff. And then if you go over to column M, you see record type. These are all factors that measure contractor qualification and responsibility. You'll see examples of a termination for cause, or material failed to comply with closeout requirements. So all these are public. This is a big, huge leap in transparency for the government. And so it's just one of the tools now that's available that we use. We're obviously continuing to progress and be more transparent, but for now, based on where we were 4 years ago, I think we made like giant leaps forward.
Thank you very much, Maria. Let me just pull the slides up here. Okay, this is our discussion questions. We're going to have to finish up by, I think it's okay if we go to a quarter past because we have a lot of interesting questions. We could address these questions, and we had a couple audience questions too. But why don't we open up the floor, and Gabriella, you want to take on the first question?
Yes, Chris, thank you very much. Very interesting, all the presentation, and I think a few words on the SPD experience and evolution, because we need to evolve the self-declaration strategy. And as we saw with Lucian and Kathrin, we need to have substantial data to be clarified and known through also more databases. So SPD as a self-certification has to develop for the cross-border use in the E30s, but E30s provides the correspondence in different countries on the declaration that permits to qualify in a country a supplier. But then it's very, very cumbersome now to have this because it's not yet implemented. So we have to evolve to a virtual company dossier, and we are trying to do this in Italy, but it's still not in place. All these tools should be integrated in the single digital gateway. So I think really we are in a moment where things are changing, and we have to develop these tools to have a virtual company dossier of each economic operator that could be shared for all the purposes, either international trade and free trade, and for all the other purposes of procurement, also to favor cross-border. Thank you very much. I want to be quick as we have a little time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And in the discussion for purposes of Zornitsa and Lucian, the European Commission, the European Union is really often on the cutting edge. In terms of negotiating trade agreements that have to do with procurement. At this point, the EU is well ahead of the United States working internationally. Where do you think it's possible that some of these issues that have been raised, such as a standardized qualification data structure, do you see those issues could be resolved, Zornitsa and Lucian? Do you think it could be resolved through trade agreements?
Well, let me have a quick attempt to reflect upon that very interesting question. To be honest, I think it is something to reflect upon seriously. Essentially, if we look at even the most ambitious free trade agreements we have with public procurement provisions, we have now New Zealand, which is finalized, but let's use the ones that are enforced, like Canada, for instance. We haven't reached that level of regulatory cooperation between entities to even consider such provisions. Now, is it a pie in the sky? I don't know. I think someone has to maybe show the benefits, start with perhaps a pilot project, and then gradually, especially when you know that you have a long-standing partner with a legally binding agreement, a trade agreement, which may be updated over time, you may add these additional features in the trade agreement through an evolutionary clause in the treaty. So I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's been considered so far as maybe too good to be true. But I take very good notice of your suggestion today, and I guarantee it's on my to-do list now.
Thank you, Lucian.
Chris, if I may add. Sorry? Chris, do you hear me?
We do, yes.
Yeah, if I may complement what Lucian said, I also think that's a great idea. right? I mean, what you're talking about, but if we look back and look at the GPA that had actually a binding provision on exchanging information, statistical data on government procurement, then those provisions were a little bit relaxed in the last modification of the GPA. And then if we track how countries and parties complied with this information, I mean, we can see that there was not enough impetus at that time at the level of the parties to actually take those commitments seriously and to provide that information. So I think we should learn from the past, and maybe there is a way to kind of show really the benefits, because I think that is what is probably one of the most important points, that parties did not understand that this is beneficial for both sides. So not only for the party providing the information, but also for that party as well, because then you have much more information about what is going on in your own procurement markets. So I think working on explaining the benefits to all about having this transparent and open, harmonized data, at best with commonly agreed unique identifiers for firms. I mean, it is really something all parties can benefit from. And I think that aspect is a little bit lost, that this could bring a lot of benefits for all sides.
Thanks, Zornitsa. And that leads to the second question, the discussion question for Dana and for Uwe. The starting point for a lot of the interesting data analysis that Lucian and Zornitsa have done is a recognition that there's a home preference in procurement. Very small transnational procurement in the United States government, only a few percentage points. Very small cross-border, transborder procurement in the European Union, even among the member states. That's oftentimes attributed to chauvinism, that there is a desire to purchase from one's own countrymen. But I wonder whether or not it's due to transaction costs, where contracting personnel have a hard time assessing contractor qualification from abroad. So they default to domestic contractors where they don't have those transaction costs. Based on your experience, you're in a centralized purchasing body there in Austria. You train centralized purchasing officials from across Europe. If we reduce the transaction costs, will it make it easier to have trans-border procurement?
Well, for sure, I think it would bring more efficiency into the entire process, and it would reduce the transaction costs, definitely. But today we were talking a lot about cross-border procurement from the perspective of economic operators, qualification criteria, and so on. But I would like to bring into the discussion also cross-border procurement between member states, which in my view would allow companies from other member states to participate into tenders initiated by another member state. So to make it more cross-border also from the perspective of economic operators. So when two different member states join forces and they purchase in a centralized manner, then also economic operators would benefit from this cross-border cooperation. And I think this perspective should be brought into the discussion, because I think it could increase a lot cross-border trade as well.
Thank you very much. So the next discussion point is for Tünde. And Tünde, you see the question here is whether or not you've studied a lot of European systems, and European systems oftentimes will deal with past performance information and contractor qualification information as one. The United States technically divides it. They deal with past performance. The US federal government deals with past performance information separately from qualification information. And the past performance information is much more protected. Past performance information is not publicly available. Well, a lot of the qualification information that Maria referred to is available publicly. Do you think it makes sense to conflate the two?
Well, I think that's a very good question. But the first and the main aspect is the quality of the information. Because if we just, or the bidders just have to declare about their past performance activities, or their existence, for example, if they are coming from Asia and we do not have company records in our, for example, European countries about those particular companies, then in general, the self-declaration is not enough. So it doesn't make sense to distinguish because we do not know anything about those companies. But answering for the question, I do think that if we have a good quality information, then it really makes sense to distinguish in between qualification and contract to past performance. We now in the European Union use it as part of the exclusion grounds and eligibility criteria. If we use it as part of the exclusion grounds, then all the bidders, economic operators have opportunity to self-clean themselves if, let's say, their behavior was unacceptable in the last couple of years. But if they use it as an eligibility criteria, then they are able to, let's say, involve capacity organization and lighten the minimum requirements in public procurement. So first of all, we have to make it clear that if we use this information, qualification and contractor past performance information, then we have to use it in a proper way. If we lighten the system, then finally all of these information will be, let's say, not as important. But we have, for example, as Mishi mentioned and showed the solution of the qualification of certain economic operators, we have tools which are able to help contracting authorities to understand the characteristics of the market and to get more information about their future economic operators. And maybe this information could be very, very important if they, for example, build long-term procurement models like framework agreements or dynamic purchasing systems. So this is the reason why I think that it really makes sense to distinguish in between qualification and contractor past performance and focusing more on the existing and relevant high quality information in the system.
Thank you very much for that. So the next is for Albert. Albert, you've probably done more study on both sides of the Atlantic than anybody else in the world, based on your incredible PhD dissertation, your work since then. Returning this question of the role of trade agreements, what role do you see trade agreements playing in solving some of these transborder problems?
I think that what Lucian and Zornitsa said earlier is already the best answer we can give, which is that this is a bit far away from where we are at. And I think what we need to question is what could the trade agreement do? And I think it could probably do three things. So one is facilitate the exchange of information, and then it might go beyond open data. If open data is already there, then what's the point of putting it in the trade agreement? The second thing it could do is facilitate administrative cooperation, but that's one of the things that trade agreements don't tend to do much because of the issue of doubts about mutual recognition, and then different legal systems. So in the EU, for example, now we have the problem that the Court of Justice wants each contracting authority to make up its own mind as to whether somebody that was excluded by another contracting authority should also be excluded in a specific procurement process. So the trade agreement, even if it tried to facilitate administrative cooperation, could not alleviate those domestic legal stumbling blocks. And the final thing it could do is then make some provisions, for example, for professionalization and try to bind the countries to skill up the task force. And I think that's probably the areas where you have a bit more leeway, because in the end, this is going to depend on whoever has access to the information and knows the legal system making specific decisions. And maybe that's where the trade agreements could do more in trying to bind the countries to specific commitments in investment in professionalization, exchange of views and things like this, which are not done so far in trade agreements. But I'm a bit reluctant to push for trade agreements to do all these things because they already do loads of other things. And I also think we may end up creating more litigation than we think with all of these issues. One thing that worries me is, say, we have a very close exchange of information, US, EU, and then we get information about everyone debarred in the US, but then we don't have information about people debarred in so many other jurisdictions. So US debarred bidders may start claiming that they are not treated equally because their situation is assessed in a different way than it is with others in the world. So I think it's a bit of a complicated picture, and there is no silver bullet. I guess all we can do is just, as was suggested, try to keep evidencing why having more information and being more at once in exclusion and debarment has benefits, and then just convince the contracting authorities to do something like that. Another thing that could be done, I think was suggested in the Q&A, is to just go sectoral. So for example, defense, where probably we have much more concentrated industries, everybody knows much more who are the players. We could have a broader, closer collaboration that could be enacted in the trade agreements than just talking about things generally. But yeah, just a bit skeptical, but most of the points that were made were good points.
Thank you very much, Albert. We have Paolo Magina with us. This is an experiment. I've allowed him to talk if he can hear us. Paolo, are you with us?
Yes, I am here.
Oh, brilliant.
This is a surprise. I was not expecting you to reach out to me, but I was just happily following.
I know. I always joke. I say, if the Messiah shows up in one of our webinars, we have to let the Messiah speak. You are the Messiah.
Chris, you are so kind.
What are the key authors behind the professionalization report that we've mentioned before from the OECD? So, Paolo, the floor is yours, and then we're going to have to close down.
Okay, thank you, Chris, and thanks to all of you for the very lively and interesting discussion. Well, I think most of the things were said, and I agree that professionalization would bring a key dimension for allowing practitioners to be better prepared to do this cross-border work. And I also agree with what Dana said regarding encouraging more collaboration between public organizations from different countries to try to come up with tenders that matter more for people that are focusing on a single market. We are about to start a few projects in Europe around this collaboration and joint procurement. And I see on the screen many people that are capable of bringing added value to these projects. So hopefully, maybe towards the end of the year, we will have more things to say about it. But thank you, Chris, for bringing this important topic to the discussion. And I think it's something that we need to keep in mind. And I heard NASPO before talking about the US, but we also know that it's possible to maybe adapt and tailor some of their frameworks to be able and useful to be used in Mexico, for instance. No, there are many possibilities that we can think of. So happy to contribute and to collaborate with all of you in this regard. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Paolo, and thank you to everyone for really a very, very successful and interesting webinar. Have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.